It started on a Tuesday. This was not the Tuesday of the teacher's whispered prediction that had been weeks ago, in a different season of hope. This Tuesday was merely 2 weeks before the KCPE national exams, and it arrived with the same suffocating heat as every other day in Kisumu's endless summer. The evening routine was as suffocating as always. The jiko burned with a blistering heat that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than charcoal. Achieng knelt before it, feeding it scraps of dry biomass, watching the flames lick upward with a hunger that mirrored her own. The onions hit the dark oil in the saphuria with an aggressive sizzle that spat droplets of hot fat onto her forearms. She didn't flinch. She had long ago stopped flinching. The serving was silent. Scraped tin plates were filled with ugali and sukuma wiki, passed from hand to hand in a chain of necessity that required no words. The youngest child ate first, then the stepfather, then the mother, then the other children, then Achieng. What remained was what she ate. Sometimes it was enough. Often it was not. Later, when the house had settled into the rhythms of evening, the stepfather in his armchair, the mother rocking the youngest to sleep, the other children sprawled on the floor in various stages of exhaustion, retreated to the kitchen. The unlit space was cool and damp, a relief from the day's heat but carrying its own kind of oppression. The darkness was absolute. She worked by memory and touch, her hands finding the heavy saphuria by its familiar weight, her fingers locating the rusted piece of wire mesh she used for scrubbing. The ugali crust was stubborn. It had been left to harden on the bottom of the pot, a burnt layer that required pressure and persistence to remove. Achieng pressed hard, her small hands gripping the wire mesh with the determination of someone who had learned that nothing in life came without effort. A sharp prick, a tiny snag on her right index finger. She paused for a moment, holding her hand up to the faint light that filtered through the kitchen doorway. A thin line of blood welled up, dark against her skin. She examined it with the detachment of someone who had experienced worse. It was nothing, a silly, almost invisible scratch, the kind of injury that happened daily in a house where everything was worn and everything was sharp. She pressed her thumb against the wound to stop the bleeding, then returned to her scrubbing. The saphuria needed to be clean. The kitchen needed to be in order. Tomorrow would bring its own demands, and she had no time for weakness. The water she plunged her hands into came from the heavy jerrycans she had hauled from the stagnant community borehole that morning. It was not clean water. It was not safe water. It was water that carried the invisible passengers of bacteria and parasites, the microscopic invaders that thrived in conditions of poverty. But it was the only water available, and so it was the water she used. Her body hollowed out by years of inhaling toxic charcoal smoke, sleeping on a thin mattress on the floor, waking in the freezing dawn to scrub her family's clothes, eating irregularly and insufficiently, carrying burdens that would break adults half again. Her age had zero defenses left to give. The bacteria entered through the tiny breach in her skin. They multiplied in the warm, nutrient-rich environment of her bloodstream. They began their slow march up her arm, following the pathways of lymphatic vessels, establishing colonies in the tissue that had no immune response strong enough to repel them. Achieng didn't know any of this. She finished the dishes. She curled onto her mattress. She slept the sleep of the exhausted, her mind still running through tomorrow's lessons, tomorrow's equations, tomorrow's steps toward the exit. By Friday, the finger was swollen. It had happened gradually, so gradually that she might not have noticed if she hadn't needed to grip her pencil so tightly during the practice exam. But now, as she held her hand up to the gray morning light filtering through the kitchen window, she could see the change. The finger was tight, the skin stretched shiny and smooth over the swelling. It throbbed with a dull, persistent heat that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside. Her mother barely glanced at it over her morning tea. The cup was chipped, the tea weak. The mother's eyes were fixed on some middle distance, some calculation of her own that involved money and mouths, and the endless arithmetic of survival. Kazi ni kalala, tu sasa anajifanya, magonjwa, and dio usiyosh vyombo. The words lacked heat. They were not angry. They were not cruel. They were simply a customary dismissal, the default response to any claim of discomfort or pain. Work is just sleeping, and now you're pretending to be sick so you don't wash the dishes. The logic was impeccable in its cruelty. If you can walk, you can work. If you can work, you are not sick. Sickness is a luxury this house cannot afford. Achieng didn't argue. She had never won an argument in this house. She wrapped her finger in a torn strip of fabric torn from an old dress, winding it tight enough to provide some pressure, some illusion of support. She bit the inside of her cheek, a habit she had developed so long ago she no longer remembered when it started, and kept working. The fabric grew damp with pus. The swelling crept past her knuckle. The heat in her finger became a constant companion, a small fire burning at the edge of her consciousness. But she had exams to prepare for, papers to practice, equations to solve. She couldn't afford to be sick. Sickness was not in her strategy. She mapped the infection's progress the way she mapped everything, with cold observation, with data collection, with the refusal to panic. The red line that crept up her arm was just another variable. The fever that came in waves, mild at first, then stronger, was just another equation to solve. She drank water when she could. She rested when no one was watching. She told herself that her mind was strong enough to override her body, that her will was sufficient to keep the infection at bay until after the exams. But genius requires clarity, and her body was at war.